My name's Alex Singleton. I'm a professor at the University of Liverpool. I run something called the Geographic Data Science Lab. And we're kind of a mixture of academics and PhDs and postdoctoral researchers. And we do lots of work around urban analytics at the intersection between geography and data science. This talk is sort of a summary of really what we've been doing at Liverpool over the past sort of 5 or 6 years around what we're sort of referring to as data philanthropy. And I'll try and explain what all these different components are as we go through the talk, illustrate it at the end if I've got a bit of time with a couple of examples. So lots of the things that we've talked about today concern this idea of urban data and information. And there's lots of different types of urban data. So the way I organise it in my own head around sort of transactional data. So they could be from the commercial sector, when we're using stores, or they could be from the public sector. So in the UK, our hospital system, for example, will collect data about what illnesses we're going to hospital with, or the school system. Or it might be, if you're using your phone walking down the street, it could be data you're volunteering. So maybe you send a tweet, it's geotagged, so volunteer geographic information. Then there's other types of data that exist within cities. Again, you've heard a lot of different examples of that today. Some of that is from sensors which are sort of mobile and dynamic. So perhaps the ones that are attached to your phone, they link to your activities. And then there's other types of sensors which measure things about the ambient environment. So it could be a pollution sensor, or maybe it's a sensor which detects noise, which detects gunshots. But all these different data sources essentially give us an impartial picture of reality, and they're collected by lots of different organisations and actors within these urban systems. And really what we're interested in terms of urban analytics is a standard GIS phrase of turning data into information. We do this thing in the middle, this analysis thing. We've seen lots of different examples of that. So we've got the raw data, we do something to it, we do some analysis, we turn it into information. And really what urban analytics is about the wrapper for all of that process, which was GI science, and placing those into the context of social, political, ethical, and the legal sort of context of the analysis that we're doing and the implications of the analysis. I won't promote my book too much, but this was written with my colleague Seth, who's over there in the audience as well. But essentially, in our book, this is exactly what we're talking about. It's all these interesting new forms of data, what you can do to them, and how you might use that information in a way which would be sort of ethical, legal, and socially considerate. So most urban big data are consumer data of one form or another. So I like to use this slide when I'm trying to sort of articulate this problem. They're all an impartial representation, and they tell us little things about our daily lives in different ways. So we wake up in the morning, we might get into our car, commuting to work. Automatic number plate recognition might record the speed that we're doing. It might record that we've passed the same location multiple times that week. We might get to the school, we're dropping our children off. The record of your children going to that school, their attainments in school, they're recorded both at the school location but also attributed to your household location. Drop the children off at school, we might then get on some form of integrated transport system, travel to work. So again, swiping in and out of a transport system with a smart card, again generates more data about those transit patterns. We might decide then to use a mobile app to navigate to a new office location, again generating more data. Comes around to lunchtime, we go out, buy some lunch, use a store card, transactions recorded through the store card, perhaps those are aggregated to the previous histories that the companies are collecting about you, about what you've been spending at your lunch times. Then maybe later in the afternoon, we need to get a cab, so we had Uber here, so I think I've got an Uber screenshot there. We get an Uber to hospital, we've got a hospital appointment, again in the UK at least, there's national records of who went to hospital, where they live, what their illnesses were, what the outcomes were. Finally get back home, do some online shopping, again like bricks and mortar stores. Click stores also have large databases of consumer transactions, and then again relaxing after your shopping in the evening, watching Netflix, again, your recorded behaviour, what you've watched and how long you've watched it for, is also collected by someone else. So consumer data builds an incomplete picture of almost all of our activities during the day, and it's collected by lots of different organisations in the public and private sector. And it's really the challenge of how you can unlock those interesting pictures of data in a way which is ethical and legal to tell useful stories, and in the case of what we're interested in, not necessarily in a commercial context, but in terms of a social context. And data philanthropy is really built around that idea. And there's not a single model of this, and I'll discuss some of the different models through which it occurs. The idea is, particularly for private sector organisations, it's a way in which they can release their data for social goods, so enabling people to use their data for research which could benefit society. And there's a number of quite high-profile examples, so MasterCard have released data for use, and the more recent example would be Facebook. So Facebook have partnered with Harvard University and have created specific mechanisms around which people can apply to do projects using those data. Why are companies interested in doing this? Well, there's a number of potential reasons why. The first could be a general feeling of goodwill, the idea that they want to give back to the community, and there's this idea of corporate responsibility, and it's a good way to demonstrate that. You could use it as brand building. It promotes your brand as a good brand to engage with. And you might argue that it's also about reputation protection. So if you're Facebook and you've received some criticism about your data, it's a way in which you can kind of underwrite that perhaps you're not all bad and so on. So there's some other slightly different reasons why the companies that we've engaged with, and I'll come on to that in a little while, have been interested in giving out their data. One which was quite surprising to us when we first started this project was around recruitment. So data science is very hard to recruit to in the UK, and by engaging with universities, it also engages with the networks that we produce, i.e. our graduates. So they actually found it as a useful recruitment tool. It could be an opportunity to sell data into businesses, so it could be part of a business model. So the idea is that you're promoting things for the company on their behalf. And it also could be exploring potential new markets or a very low-cost form of research and development if you haven't got a research and development function within your organisation. And there's two types of data that emerge from this, from two types of organisations. Sort of brokers of data, so people who collect data together from lots of sources and resell it. An example of that in the UK could be something like a consumer dynamics file, so it could be something like an electoral roll. And then many other sources of individual level data from surveys aggregated into this large database of where people live, potentially with some characteristics, and repackaged and sold as a data product. So data brokers tend to sell data products. They're in the business of selling data products rather than generating their own data. Data controllers are the people who tend to generate data. So that might be, for example, your organisation with a store card system, and they tend to be generating that data, not necessarily to resell as a product, but as a byproduct of the thing that they're doing, such as operating a grocery store, for example. And those data tend to be operational. There are differences in terms of these data, in terms of the costs and benefits of accessing them. So in terms of brokered data, the type of data that you buy, it tends to be, if you're an academic at least, very easy to get, because essentially there's a set of products, you can go and just buy them. You've got to have the money to be able to buy them. One of the disadvantages of that is it's actually quite difficult to get decent metadata for them. So you won't necessarily know how they've been created or what the caveats might be. Those details can be hidden, and it's not really in the company's interest to highlight flaws in the data, because they're in the business of selling data. For that reason, they can be difficult to use in an academic context, but not impossible. If you're a data owner, so if you can actually get to the commercial organisation, for example, generating the data, the national supermarket chain or high street retailer, and you can convince them that they can give you your data, potentially that can be of higher value And it tends to be of higher value because they really understand the data, sort of warts and all, and can usually articulate a fairly clear picture of how it's generated and what the problems are, because they say they use it day to day for their own customer segmentation. It's in their interest to try and maintain data quality, and they tend to be, from our experience, a little bit more open about the problems with the data. So when we've been doing our work, we always try and aim for those kind of data sets, but they often are challenging, and they do require quite a long run in terms of relationship building in order to get access to them. So there are, when I was thinking about models of data philanthropy, there are sort of a number of different ways in which this kind of emerges. And then I'll also talk a little bit about our model that we've developed. There's a model which is the business just releases some data which is anonymous and doesn't have any sort of individual sensitivities to it, although sometimes they actually can have individual sensitivities which emerge later, which can cause negative problems for the company. So that might be through open competitions of Kaggles, or it might be just one-to-one relationships between academics signing non-disclosure agreements. Certainly when I first started my academic career, I had lots of NDAs with different companies and just did work with data that they were quite happy to give me for a particular project. Another way in which it happens in the UK at least is on-site access. You can actually go and work in a company and use the data. There's actually some examples in the UK where particularly universities have installed VPNs within the firewalls to enable access through the firewalls of organisations direct to the database as well. So that's another model which happens. Other organisations create aggregate versions of their data which aren't particularly sensitive commercially or in terms of disclosure, and enable access through an API. You might argue, because there's been pre-processing, it's not really data as such, it's information, it is presented data. So again, you don't get back to the raw materials, so it can be problematic to use. There are lots of constraints for all of this happening. First being is that the time that companies spend doing this kind of stuff is time that they're not doing the things which are important for their operations, they're not making money. In the UK at least, the bits of the organisations which tend to deal with data are incredibly short-staffed. There's not enough data scientists that people can recruit, so that means there's not as much time that people can spend on these projects which aren't core to the business. There's issues with companies being risk adverse. You don't want to have headlines about your data being leaked into the public domain. You can do a lot of reputational damage, and particularly in the way in which data protection has been tightened up within Europe through GDPR, the implications for leaking individual level data are actually quite severe, and there's serious jail terms that you could do if you were found guilty of a sort of a particularly bad breach. And also, from the other side, if you want to get data from a company, who on earth do you ask? And that's a really challenging question. And in fact, historically, academics have done well in this field simply from having a robust network of people they know they can go to get access to data. So it's not egalitarian at all. So those are the kind of challenges which we aim to address through something called the Consumer Data Research Centre, which was funded about 5 years ago, and the funding for this runs out in February. And this is a project which we've worked on with University of Leeds, University College London, and Oxford University. And the idea is that, the overarching idea is we were going to be honest brokers for these types of data. So we had a good established network, and then it's how we can enable access to the data that these organisations are within our network for the wider academic community. And this whole process takes a huge amount of time. So when I started putting these slides together, I started thinking back all the stages through which we built this network, and it goes right back to when I sort of just started my PhD. Started working with a network of retailers initially through something in the UK called the Geodemographics user group, and we were kind of the academic partners in this, and we would go along to their annual events and some of their training workshops, got to know the people who work there. And then over time, we started doing this annually, year on year. Another initiative came along, and we got a small block of funding from the Economic and Social Research Council to run a master's dissertation scheme. And what this enabled us to do was to essentially act as matchmakers between academics, students and industrial partners. And we could organise small, focused consumer data-based master's dissertation topics. And that essentially has run all the way through to the current day and evolved into the CDRC. And the CDRC service had a much broader agenda to both continue this engagement strategy with retailers and other consumer data organisations, but also provide strong governance and facilities through which people can access these data. So in order to give assurance, there's really two things that are crucial to this. The first thing, as I said, is this network, and you really know these people well, and you know what the problems will be, you know which types of data are the ones you'll never get access to and not worth pursuing, and those which are potential to integrate into this kind of service. And then the second aspect of it is having facilities where you can demonstrate to commercial partners that you really understand how to look after their data, and you've got strong governance procedures that they can be absolutely reassured that you're not going to provide any problems to them in terms of their data being misused or leaked. So really that was we spent probably 2 years refining this process. We built up a series of infrastructure, which I'll come on to briefly as we're going through. But the way in which we tend to hook consumer data organisations into this model is through this thing we call the ladder of engagement. And it starts off fairly low-level engagement, so we'll introduce them with things like masters projects and and events. And then going forward, we'll sort of build on those initial relationships through things like PhD projects. Maybe we'll do particular joint research projects together because we have a data science resource within the network. And then the objective of all of this is to convince people that there's value in this relationship with the Consumer Data Research Centre, and that we are okay to look after potentially the crown jewels of their organisations, these large data repositories, and also provide governance for access to them from third parties aren't necessarily within those universities I mentioned at the start. So that's really what the ladder of engagement does. It's different ways in which people can engage throughout that process with the objective of ultimately us having some deposits of their data which we can then provide to other people. The other thing that we do with their data is we try to take it from the most secure, so that will often be individual level data with very disclosive properties, and turn it into something which is not sensitive, and it's not from a disclosure perspective, and not sensitive from a commercial perspective. These data products, we will try and get them so we can actually disseminate them in the public domain, so we can just put them on a website, you can go and download them. And this is another way in which we try and take data through this system from the most secure, where we're locking it up in sort of a secure basement, through to the least, to the most open, which would be just having it on a website and on a map. So that's the general process. We try and take the secure data, turn it into data products, and then disseminate it. And the way in which we gain access, the way in which we gain users to our service are through two portals. So we have a mapping portal, which is at the URL maps.cdrc.ac.uk, and lots of our data products we put on here, and then some of the raw data, particularly particular spatial granularities, which enable us to put it in the public domain on here as well, plus lots of other open data about the UK. That's been quite popular, so we get about 150,000 visits through that, I think, since we opened it. All the maps which you see on the Maps portal also link to a bespoke CCAN that we've developed, which has both the data that you can see on the Maps portal, but also lots of other data packs. We took most open data in the UK and we tidied it up and also organised it into small data packages that people can download for different geographic extents. So for simplicity, we chose all of the local authority boundaries, which are like city boundaries almost in the UK, and then also some of the new regional boundaries, which are like metropolitan statistical areas in the US. And that's, again, been quite a popular site. We've got just under 10,000 people registered on that. Unfortunately, you have to register on this site before you can download a file. The license itself is open. That was a constraint of the funders, but actually it's been quite useful for us to see who's using the data and for what purposes, which has been quite helpful for when we've been bidding for sort of additional funding. Again, we've had quite a lot of downloads on that, 126,000. And also another thing that we've added on here recently as well is some training materials which are all open, which actually use the data for R and Python and QGIS or general visualization. Okay, so that's really what the CDRC is. And then I suppose the second bit of this talk, how much longer have I got? A while?
About 8 minutes.
8 minutes? I can do it in 8 minutes. That'll be okay. So the CDRC infrastructure enables you to have all these data of different levels of sensitivities. And I've got just 2 short case studies really of how we've used that data in practice. And one of the things that we're really interested in Liverpool in particular is this idea of urban context and what those urban contexts mean for different types of behaviour. So these are, for those not familiar with Liverpool, 2 areas in Liverpool. The leafy looking area there is my street. That is not my street. So that's South Liverpool. This is North Liverpool. This is probably one of the most deprived areas in the UK, where that picture is on the right. That's the university on the left. People in my area, most people go and work at the university or hospital next door. This is the docks in Liverpool. You can see the football ground in the background. And again, this is adjacent to quite deprived areas in Liverpool. Liverpool is an incredibly mixed city. It's both very affluent and also very deprived. And where you live has massive implications in terms of your life outcomes. What you buy, what you spend, whether you end up in hospital because you've had a heart attack or a broken leg from your skiing holiday, whether you're buying food in a sort of supermarket chain or buying what you can afford in your local shop. And that's why urban context is interesting to us, at least. And we do a lot of work in this area called Geodemographics, which essentially we take lots of data about people and the places that they live. We collate it together and we create these indicators which give you an idea of the type of people living in particular places. This is a national geodemographic called the AHAH area classification that we built a few years ago with the Office of National Statistics. And I'll show you a couple more examples of some new stuff that we've developed through this CDRC infrastructure. Just skip that. We're pushing at the moment this model of hybrid geodemographics. So that first geodemographic I showed you, essentially all of the data are created from the census, and all of the census data are open, which means that you can just go and download it off a website, open it up on your laptop, build your geodemographic, make a map, off you go. The data that we used for the next 2 examples come from a range of different sources through the CDRC. So what we have to do is we have to build the classification in the most secure tier, because we're actually going to use secure data, which is a safe room essentially in the basement of a building, which you need to have swipe card access to, where we ingest other data sets which are available in less secure tiers into that secure tier, and then we produce outputs which we can disseminate publicly. And that's the hybrid geodemographic framework we've used for 2 examples, which I'll go through now. So one of the first things that we looked at in terms of substantive problems in the UK is the retail context. And the retail context is very interesting because it's a bit of a barometer for how well local areas are doing economically. Like in the US, we've had quite a number of large chains, for example, close. And if you actually look across retail space in the UK, some retail centres are still thriving, others have really declined. The numbers of vacancies has gone up quite drastically, and also the mixes of different types of retail have changed in those particular localities as well. in part, one of the interest areas for us was some of these issues relate to sort of wider economic issues, stagnation of wages or changes of preferences in retail. But the thing that we were particularly looking at in this context is the impact of the internet on retail. So just two examples from the press this week. Amazon are looking at investing in sort of bricks and mortar stores. Online retailing is booming in certain, because this is, I'm not sure if they're international, but certainly in the UK, boohoo.com, its valuation is sort of skyrocketing. And then I had a flashback to the 90s when I first started coding and the dot-com bubble. And then I ironically remember that there was this book, which is actually another fashion retailer called Boo, where there was a Boo book. Anyway, I just put that in because I found it on my shelf and I thought it was quite interesting. But anyway, I digress. So the idea is we essentially collated lots of data about internet user behaviour from a series of commercial surveys, and we collated that together with other open data. We had some data from online retailers about actual consumption patterns from some of these online fashion brands, built a geodemographic model which formed this thing called the Internet User Classification. And this was an open classification. You can go and download the 2018 version, and it's entirely free, even though it has some of these commercial data sort of embedded within it. And you can see here, there's a map here of Colchester. So this is in a reasonably affluent bit of Essex. You don't need to worry about it too much in terms of the context, but if you see that the colours completely change when you go to that area called Bootle, which I said was quite deprived where those docks were earlier in my talk. So it picks up interesting patterns of use of the internet. Now, on the basis of the idea of we know what the demographics are doing, so you know areas where people are doing lots of online shopping, areas where people are doing very little online shopping. We also know where retail centres are located and what the composition of those retail centres are. Now, there are certain types of retail which are more likely to have problems and more likely to be exposed to online competitors. So if you're a retail centre full of record shops and bookshops, probably not going to fare too well in sort of against the likes of Amazon. But if you're, a very small retail centre, perhaps quite affluent area full of sort of delicatessens and sort of fancy cheese shops and coffee shops, probably okay, not so much online competition in those particular localities. So what we did was, we looked both at the distribution of the types of retail within retail centres, and then also the likely catchment areas of those retail centres and the distribution of these internet user classification segments within those localities. And by balancing those two things together, we developed this measure called e-resilience. And in a nutshell, what that does is it shows you which retail centres are more at risk of having adverse effects of the internet impact upon them. And the findings actually, when you map them, are quite interesting. So you probably don't know, if you don't know the UK geography, this big blue block here is London. These white dots are retail centres. And all these red splashes are the ones that are not particularly resilient. And what they are, if you look in the retail literature, they tend to be retail centres referred to as clone towns. And what clone towns are is fairly generic offerings where there's nothing particular to drag people to those centres, and those are the ones where people are quite likely to switch their behaviours out to other more specialist centres, or those offers will be more likely to be provided online in the future. That's quite interesting. Have I got time for my second example? Yeah, okay, right. So that's example one. Right, example two, and I borrowed these slides off my colleague, who, what cartoons? He's very, very keen on The Simpsons. So anyway, he always uses this slide, which actually I've always sort of didn't like, and then actually looked at it, it was quite good. So this idea is that the general idea of this project was that where you live has an impact on your health. It's a fairly obvious statement. So, if you live in an area which happens to be next to a load of factories, it's obviously kind of negative impact on your health. There's lots of literature to suggest if you've got lots of opportunities near you to do things like eat burgers, shop generally in sort of poor quality stores, go to the pub a lot, spend a lot of money on gambling, those things are sort of health negating. Likewise, if you're near outdoor space where you can go and have a run, that's sort of health promoting. Or if you're near sort of leisure facilities, again, health promoting. The opportunities for good health are there. The geography of these things differs very, very wildly in the UK and most places. And actually looking at things at a neighbourhood level is quite sensible, because it's actually a good unit for which policymakers can actually intervene. So, for example, there's lots of new planning regulations in the UK around whether you can actually get planning permission for having fast food outlets near schools or in school catchment districts. So we built this indicator which takes a whole range of different data sets, again using the CDRC infrastructure. Some of them relate to the physical environment, so we look at things such as air quality, walkability, access to green space. We look at health services, so things like GPs, dentists, pharmacies, hospitals, and those with A&E services, and then also private sector leisure services as well. And then also different types of retail. So we look at fast food outlets, as an example from the first slide. Now, this next one looks a bit funny. And you actually do find, when you actually measure accessibility to all these different things, quite interesting patterns. So this measure along the x-axis is the index of multiple deprivation in deciles. On the left is the most deprived, and on the right is the least deprived. So you find that the distance, which is the y-axis, you find that the more deprived area, the closer you are to fast food outlets, and the closer you are to gambling outlets. These are the national pictures. Pubs and nightclubs are fairly evenly split. But you find that these are the national picture, but actually at the local level these vary quite a lot. And essentially what we do is we create a large data set where we bring all these data together, and we created this overall index called AHAH. Alan Partridge reference. That was deliberate. He's also not only a fan of The Simpsons, he's also a fan of Alan Partridge, so there we go. And we create this overall index, which is a bit like the index of multiple deprivation, but specifically for the health context of local environments. With all these projects, we tend to like to work with external partners. So this one in particular got picked up by Public Health England and integrated into what they call their fingertips tool, which looks at the wider determinants of health. So each local authority in the UK can now get an AHAH profile for their local authority and benchmark their performance against other local authorities. And this is kind of an evolving measure, so we're actually updating this all the time, and hopefully we'll get a new version out this side of Christmas. Okay, so a fairly eclectic set of slides, I would say there. I think that the general takeaways is that cities are awash with lots of different types of data, and they sit within the public and the private sector, and they offer an impartial picture of what's going on in our cities and urban areas. Most of the data about urban areas are consumer data in one form or another, and having a model through which we can access data like that is really important to be able to do good social science. And the CDRC, which I sort of briefly described today, is just one model of data philanthropy, which we think in the UK context has really sort of worked, and it's actually sort of produced some good outputs over the past sort of 5 or 6 years. The absolutely critical thing for that type of model, in addition to having strong governance and infrastructure to support it, is the very, very, very long build-up of trust with different organisations who will actually provide data into such a service, and having ways in which, as the organisation providing access to the data and also external partners can engage with those data. So some sort of ladder of engagement or framework for engagement is also really important. And then the final point, which I showed you in terms of our data and maps portal, they've been absolutely critical to enable people who don't know about us to find out about us, because whenever we do a press release, we accompany it with the maps or the data portal, and everything we produce is on there. So it's very simple to find things that you actually want to use in your own work, or things that you didn't know about existed. We're just about to time. Thank you.